Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the webinar. Today's seminar topic is Privacy in Healthcare. Are your HIPAA practices Cyberlaw compliant? If you would like a copy of today's presentation, you can download it in the handout section of the webinar interface. If you have a question, you can type it into the questions section of the webinar interface. And now, let me turn it over to our speakers, Attorney Eric Boughman and Technologist Tony Pizzi.
Thank you, Isabel. Go ahead, Eric.
All right, thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Boughman. I'm lucky to be joined today by Anthony Pizzi, Tony Pizzi, he goes by generally. Tony is a technology specialist with a master's in computer science, somebody whom I've worked with for quite some time. We had Skip Sell was supposed to join us today, but he is unable to make it. He's actually in got something going on. He's in a court proceeding right now, so he had to miss us today, but I appreciate Tony being with us. And we're continuing our monthly presentation on privacy in healthcare. This is a hot topic. We've had a lot of interest in this over the last couple of months. We're going to continue with this series over the next few months because there's a lot of updates that are coming out from various government agencies. Primary among those is HHS, Health and Human Services, but there's other government agencies that are involved in both the privacy issues and healthcare specifically with respect to HIPAA and high-tech and compliance with healthcare privacy practices. We're going to talk about some of the more recent updates today. I'm especially happy to have Tony with us today because there's some legal issues that we'll discuss related to the Cybersecurity Act of 2015 and some reports and requirements that came out of that. But then it gets into some technical issues, and so we have Tony here to explain some of the technical pieces of the more recent report that HHS released. So with that, we'll move on to our table of contents, and unless, Tony, you have anything to add. Okay, so Tony will jump in a few minutes here. So here's our agenda for today. We're just going to do a general HIPAA overview. We generally start every seminar with this. It's a nice refresher, and it lays the foundation for where we are and why some of what we have as far as rules and regulations and laws related to privacy in the healthcare industry, and a little background on enforcement and rulemaking activities for HIPAA. As I said, it's primarily HHS that's involved in the enforcement, and specifically within Health and Human Services, it's the Office of Civil Rights. But we also see the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, taking action. We'll probably do another webinar specifically on other government organizations who have been engaged in HIPAA enforcement. States attorneys general can and have brought actions for healthcare privacy violations, and HIPAA is the basis, but there's other potential actions as well, just with respect to general privacy information in healthcare. We also have potential criminal actions. The FBI can get involved, and other federal law enforcement where there is criminal conduct such as hacking, phishing, and other things that we're going to talk about later today. So we'll talk about just the background for some of the enforcement rulemaking. Then we're going to jump into this report that was recently issued. It just came out. It's almost hot off the press. It was right late December of 2018, and the report is Healthcare Industry Cybersecurity Practices. It was released by HHS, and the purpose of the report generally is to help industry professionals, healthcare industry professionals, achieve cybersecurity and privacy compliance in the healthcare industry. And it's not law, but as we'll talk about a little bit further in, HHS has provided a framework to businesses, healthcare businesses, to achieve compliance with HIPAA and potentially it could provide for safe harbor in the event of a legal action that somebody brought against a business for HIPAA violation. So if you had a breach, or if you had an unintended disclosure of protected health information, and you were following the guidelines that are set out in the HICP report, then by following those guidelines, you could potentially create a defense for yourself showing that your actions were reasonable. Also, although HIPAA does not provide a private cause of action, so an individual can't necessarily sue directly for HIPAA violations, HIPAA and the rules and regulations established by HHS and other agencies do provide a baseline for what we in law would call reasonable behavior, or reasonable activity, or a standard of care, so to speak, so that if you are meeting the standards set forth by the agency, there's a good argument that you are not acting negligently, where there are state actions that individuals have brought in private actions to sue companies for unauthorized release of healthcare information, and the action that often looks like is a negligence action. It's just a plain old negligence, not much different than if you had a car accident and somebody hit somebody else and you sue them for negligence. If a healthcare business discloses your private information without your authority, and if that disclosure violates HIPAA, although they can't necessarily sue for a HIPAA violation, they can sue for the invasion of privacy, or for the public disclosure of private facts, or some type of action in a negligence or tort, and use HIPAA and other rules established by HHS as a basis for private action. They could say, by not following these guidelines that have been set out, you've acted negligently. So we'll talk about the report, the importance of the report, and then we'll conclude with some final comments and take questions throughout the seminar. So if you have questions, please type them into the GoToWebinar box, and we'll try to address those as we go through the material.
And Eric, a lot of this material is still being formed, right? I mean, so we have some laws that have been out there, but there's still a lot in proposal. I mean, we're seeing a lot of security issues popping up more and more these days, and data security is a very, very big topic, and it seems like every day it's just growing more and more. This is something that we didn't hear much of maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but now with them coming out with the HIPAA laws, and also now the cybersecurity laws, these are fairly new, correct?
Yeah, that's a great point, Tony. And actually, if you flip on to the next slide, we'll use that sort of as a little backdrop for the history here. So, HIPAA now is recognized as a privacy statute, or as a privacy law. And I think that's a typo there. It should be 1996. I believe was when HIPAA was passed. So it's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. But HIPAA was not initially drafted for security and privacy. It was designed to help streamline the delivery of healthcare services, and allow people to achieve more efficiency, better communication between different agencies, between healthcare providers and health insurance companies and clearinghouses. And the goal was initially to create a standard for delivery of information. But in doing that, it quickly became recognized that especially moving information into computer form, that standardization of information created privacy and security risks. But more to your point, Tony, with the more recent laws, HIPAA, part of what HIPAA did is it mandated HHS and OCR to pass specific rules to help facilitate the transfer of information and to provide for the protection of that information. And so we have the HIPAA. The two main rules that came out of HIPAA are the privacy rule and the security rule. And those are relatively recent laws. The privacy rule came out in 2003, and the security rule in 2005. There's later dates on our slides here, but those were the most recent updates. So these rules have continued to be updated by HHS. But the privacy rule in 2005 essentially established a set of standards for the protection of private health information, and those standards relate to a general practice known as fair information privacy practices. And these are a set of privacy tenets rooted in our Fourth Amendment privacy law and in the U.S. Privacy Act of 1974. And these principles and practices actually carry across not only in the U.S. and in the healthcare industry, but in other industries such as the financial services industry and in other countries. We've seen it recently with GDPR. We see states passing laws. All of it sort of traces its roots back to these principles of fair information practices. And generally those are things such as transparency, no private or secret collection of information and data, allowing for individual participation. So the privacy rule, one thing the privacy rule did under HIPAA is required healthcare providers that were covered entities to provide notice to the people that they serve, to the patients and so forth, on privacy practices, and give you an opportunity to review your healthcare records, to ensure that those records were accurate, you have a right to limited use of your information only for the purposes for which the information is provided, so that your health information can't be bought and sold on the open market. Covered entities subject to HIPAA are required to minimize the amount of data necessary kept on their systems necessary to provide services and nothing more. And it also began to implement standards for data quality, data integrity, making sure that data was correct, that it was properly maintained, and data security. That led us into the security rule of HIPAA, which applies to the electronic information, or EHI, and that came about. That wasn't implemented until 2005. And so here's an interesting note. When the HIPAA security rule was first drafted and released, we didn't even have an iPhone. The iPhone wasn't released until after the security rule. And so a lot of the data that we're used to being able to carry around in our pocket today with smartphones and tablets and pads and so forth, and a lot of what creates the risks, didn't even exist when these rules came into play. But these rules aren't that old. We're talking about, within the last, 10, 15 years is when we've seen these rules, and we continue to see them updated. So excellent point with respect to the fact that these rules are not only fairly new. I mean, when you compare them in the context of, Fourth Amendment law, going back, rights to privacy, and the constitutional cases that have talked about private rights going back into the 1960s and 70s, talking about laws that really are developing through the 2000s. These are recent laws and really needing to be updated and continually reevaluated because of our rapid advancements in technology. And we'll see that as we start to see some of the risks that are identified in the HICP report.
Yeah, and it looks like they build on each other. So, I mean, from the HIPAA privacy rule, I mean, that's establishing the standards, and that, organizations need to have policies. And then we get into the security rule that came, a little bit later, and that says, well, now that you have these policies, that you actually have to have protection in place to actually protect the information. So you're trying to protect it, but now you have to have some electronic safeguards in place. Some computer security there, and then we get into the breach notification rule that came after that, which says, okay, now that even if you have those and you had a problem, you had a breach, we have to be notified. You have to tell people.
Right, and it's a continuing update, and the breach notification rule came about as part of the HITECH Act, which was signed into law by President Obama in 2009. And really implemented over a multi-year period into 2013, and so you have now HITECH, which which build on HIPAA, and that's the Health Information Technology and for Economic and Clinical Health Act. Kind of, it's a little bit awkward. Everybody knows it as HITECH, but HITECH introduced a few new pieces of rulemaking that relate back to HIPAA, and a primary one is the breach notification rule, which requires covered entities to give notice of breaches. They have to report, large-scale breaches have to be reported, and people affected have to be identified and notified immediately. And then breaches have to be reported at least on an annual basis to HHS. And then there's some safe harbors in there for encrypted information and so forth. So you're exactly right. These rules are continuing to build on each other. And that leads us into, and actually you can flip over to the next slide there. And that leads us over to the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. And that law was, that it didn't just relate to HIPAA. This was actually a broad sweeping law. It had several different pieces to it. Among other things, the Cybersecurity Act dealt with the transfer of information, and it was under Title I, Cyber Information, I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but it's basically a sharing. It's CISA's Cyber Information Sharing Act under Title I that dealt with the transfer of information between federal agencies and private entities. And there's a number of different pieces of law that the Cybersecurity Act amended. And one thing that it required under Title IV, Section 405D, is for HHS to do an evaluation and provide an update with respect to what the risks were associated with HIPAA. And so, why HHS? We have this information up here on the slide here, and I've talked about this before. HHS, Health and Human Services, on the federal government side, is the primary organization that's responsible for HIPAA enforcement and prosecution. Another thing that came out of HITECH is the requirement for audits. So HHS does the audits that are now required as of 2009 under HITECH. But as the notes show here, there are several other agencies that are involved in this, in the enforcement activities. So if you flip to the next slide, we'll talk about the specifics of really why we today are now talking about the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. And under Section 405D, which was titled Aligning Healthcare Industry Security Approaches, HHS was required to do an evaluation and essentially create a set of best practices and procedures for entities to follow to reduce cybersecurity risks. And that essentially involved identifying what the primary risks are, and then discussing and providing guidelines for businesses to follow, for healthcare industry businesses to adjust and meet those risks head on. Again, this report does not make law, but what it does is give guidance to businesses, and it's pretty good. I would recommend folks, I don't think we put the website on here, but you can actually go to the HHS website. You can read the report. If anybody in our listening audience here wants a copy of that, let us know, please. Either send a question into the question box, or send Tony or I an email. I can make sure you get a copy of the report. It's not very long. It's pretty easy reading. And what I really like about this report is that they break down processes according to small, medium, and large size healthcare providers and hospitals. And so they're essentially acknowledging that the same practices are not going to apply, the same practices that apply to a multi-state hospital group, a large healthcare provider with hundreds of physicians. That's not going to be the same standard that applies to your local family doctor with a single office and who's working by himself or with one other practitioner. So there's separate standards for different sizes, but it does identify and explain what the risks are and then how to meet those risks head on.
And I think we're going to talk about some of those later on.
That's right.
This presentation.
So I want to allow some time. So let's go ahead. We can flip over to the next slide. And okay, here's so for those of us who are still, those out there who are still with us, why do you care about this? Well, as I noted earlier, although you can't get sued privately for, directly under HIPAA, you can be sued for the unauthorized disclosure or release of private information, including private health information. And a lot of times that takes the form of an action that says you've been negligent. And how do I know you've been negligent? Because you're not following the minimum requirements of the federal national standard, the HIPAA standards. Now this report sort of fleshes those out even more and provides specific steps for businesses to take. So that can be a sword or it can be a shield. If you are a practitioner, if you're a business that implements these standards, and you still nonetheless have an attack and you have a breach, and there's some interesting statistics that came out associated with this report, and one of those is that according to HHS, 4 out of 5, 80% of US physicians have experienced some form of a cybersecurity attack recently, during the time they were producing this report between 2015 and 2018. So it's sort of like what they talk about here in Florida with homes with termites. There's two types: those with termites, those who've had termites and those that are going to get them. I guess that's a wood frame home. But now I hear that in association with different industries with privacy and security breaches, but especially on the healthcare side, you've got two types of businesses out there: those who've had a cyber attack and those who are going to suffer a cyber attack. And so the report provides mechanisms to defend, and it will also, I believe, although this is yet to play out because it's so new, but I think that this is, if I had a client who was defending an action and they were in compliance with this report and they had a breach anyway, I would go back to the report and say, look, we've done everything that's identified in this report, and maybe you've even gone above and beyond. And therefore, with respect to any penalties from federal organizations or fines, which you can see from HIPAA and OCR, they'll fine companies for not being in compliance or for breaches, or with respect to any private actions, we've done everything that we can that a reasonable business would do. Maybe you didn't do everything possible, but you did everything reasonable because you complied with the report, and that provides you a defense to a negligence action.
I think that's a really good point, Eric, because just because you're following these policies doesn't mean you won't have a cyber attack or some type of data loss or data theft. But I mean, it just means that you're trying to follow the best practices that are out there. Kind of like if you're parking your car at night, you want to park under a light, you want to lock the doors. You're not leaving $100 bills on the seat parked in a dark alley with the window open. So you're doing the best you can based on what we know. But new and improved, I guess I'll call them, cyber attacks are coming out every day. But we want to at least do the basics to make sure that we're taking care of the attacks that we know about.
That's exactly right. And you put it in different words and probably a little better than I explained it. But insurance is a great analogy. With cars, or now we even have cyber insurance. You have companies and people are going to suffer cyber attacks and breaches and have incidents. But you do what's reasonable, go above and beyond what's reasonable to protect yourself, and at least you protect yourself from liability. You also have, there's a PR issue here, and anybody who's ever worked on a breach response plan knows that part of that is dealing with your public image. When you have a breach, it doesn't look good for any company. And in fact, under the breach notification rules, typically it's 500 within a certain geographic region, you have to notify the media. So that's never good. And also, another note that often gets overlooked, but the ethical requirements. So the Judicial Council of the American Medical Association, canon 5.05 requires those subject, physicians and folks subject to that act or to those canons, to maintain the confidentiality of patient information. So you have not only legal, both from government enforcement, from private right of action, but ethical requirements as well. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about it.
Okay. So yeah, so as you had mentioned, there's guidelines for the basics out there, and these are some of the most relevant items that have come up. So I'm sure everyone has received a phishing email at some point. These are generally emails where somebody wants you to click on a link, or they have a document in the email that they want you to open, and there may be a link in there as well. A lot of times those links will bring you to login screens that look like your email system, whether you're using Office 365 or you're using a file storage facility like Dropbox or OneDrive or even Gmail. They just want you to log in. It's not really a real screen, but they want you to put in your user ID and password, and then that's how they capture the information. So one of the best ways to get around that kind of information, that kind of attack, would be to make sure that your organization is using multi-factor authentication. This is, you've probably seen this with some of your banks, where you try to log in and then they want to send you a text and you have to enter the number from the text. There's other mechanisms to do that, but this is called multi-factor authentication. So that's definitely something that if you aren't using, you should definitely be looking to use. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of ransomware. A lot of times, if you do get a virus, it could be a ransomware virus. And what these do is they're actually encryption viruses. So what happens is they'll encrypt the data in your system, and you won't be able to access it. And then they'll tell you, they want you to send so much Bitcoin to them before they'll give you the access code. And you're not sure if they're actually going to send you the access code or not. And who wants to pay somebody holding your data hostage? But we have seen a lot of organizations that actually have paid. I think it was the city of Atlanta actually made a big payout for a ransomware virus that they had. If you're familiar with any kind of virus, they take control of your computer, but you can't even, once the data has been manipulated, you can't really undo that. This is very good encryption that's out there today. Another area is loss or theft of equipment and data. So this is if a device is lost. So we talk about endpoint protection. An endpoint would be like your laptop, your iPad, your mobile device, anything that a user is using, a user interfaces with. We'll call that an endpoint. And so if any of these endpoints are lost, that gives somebody a door right into your data. So you want to make sure that you have security passwords on all of your computers, whether they're in the office or not. Obviously, if they're something that's mobile, like a laptop or a mobile phone, that's much more important, much more likely to be lost or stolen. But even the laptops and computers in your office, somebody could break into the office and steal the computers. They would have access to that data if the devices don't have passwords on them. So that's passwords are a good way to try to keep people out of that lost or stolen equipment. And data, as far as data being lost or stolen, you want to be careful of everyone who has access to the data. So first, only people that have a need to have access to the data should have access, and they should only have access to the data that they need. So you don't want somebody having access to all data in your entire system, unless that's their job. So, and then accidental loss, things happen, people send the wrong document to someone. So if you're sending documents, you want to make sure that you're transmitting them either encrypted or at least with a password on them. And then any of these devices, what we're learning about, you'll hear a lot now about what they call the Internet of Things, and that's everything that's connected to the internet. So from thermostats to it's not just your normal mobile devices anymore. but now people can start to see if they can hack those devices. So if you have a device that's checking for rain, for example, to see whether or not to open Windows or something like that, somebody could try to actually hack into that device and see if they can get further or deeper into your network to a place where that device may be connected. Do you want to add anything on that, Eric?
Yeah, well, a couple points. One, when we talk about, we spend a lot of time talking about cyber security, but often overlooked is just the physical security, and you hit on it with the endpoint devices. We've seen HHS enforcement actions for stolen laptop computers. The joke about the people who take the password for their computer and they stick it under their keyboard, so the janitor or somebody that accesses the office at night can get in and get into information, files that are left out and accessible, and maybe information in those files provide, birthdays and social security numbers and things of that nature, provide enough information for somebody to actually dig deeper and get further in. So physical security, administrative security, making sure that your personnel are properly trained and locking things up at the end of the night and so forth. Those are things I think that get overlooked a lot. And you mentioned, Tony, about how much data is available once somebody gets one of these, gets in. Once you kind of get a side door open, what can you get to? And I just want to point out that this goes back to this foundation of what we talked about in connection with the privacy rule and with the fair information privacy practices, which really go back to 1970s basics for the limited use and limited use of information, keeping only the minimum amount of information necessary to accomplish whatever needs to be done with respect to provider services, and data minimization. So getting rid of data that you don't need on your system and only using the data for the minimum amount necessary also provides some additional protections here. And so that's why it's important to always keep those basics in mind as we're going through these new developments.
And Eric, you had mentioned training. Training is extremely important because I think just about every office I've walked into, I've seen someone that has a sticky note on their computer with their password on it. Most of the hacks that happen aren't because there was some slick hacker in Russia or somewhere that figured out how to hack the system and broke in through some grandiose plan. It's usually through what they call social engineering, and this is somebody sending an email saying they're from some place that they're not, or somebody giving a call to someone and saying, hey, I'm from the IT department, I need to check something. Hey, can you log in for me? In fact, why don't you just give me your password? So if people are trained to try to detect some of these scams, that's the large majority of the way people get in. It's social engineering, and then once they get the information, exactly as you said, now that they have access to the system, then they can snake all the way through it and see what they can find, if they want to download the data and release it to people, or if they want to put a ransomware in there to encrypt all the data so no one can use it, or even worse, if they want to manipulate the data and change it, which could really be a huge problem. Imagine that with medical records. If I changed your medical records for someone else's medical records, it just gets very, very messy. You could have a lot of problems there.
And one other thing on these connected devices, we saw recently the auto industry was worried when they had the videos of Jeeps being run off or whatever vehicles being controlled by hackers getting into the radio system. So now the auto industry, there's policies to separate the radio systems from the braking system. But as we get more devices connected to the internet, companies are coming out with insulin pumps that are internet connected and can be monitored by healthcare providers. Of course, pacemakers, and there was the story a few years ago about Dick Cheney when he was having some type of procedure, there was something going on, he had his pacemaker disconnect, or maybe when George Bush was having a procedure done, Cheney had his pacemaker disconnected. So that somebody couldn't hack in and mess with his pacemaker. We haven't seen, that I'm aware of, any specific standards for the development of medical devices connected to the Internet of Things, but that's something I would be on the lookout for. If you're in the technology industry, I would expect to see that in the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's such a new area, the Internet of Things, and connecting other devices other than computers, or endpoints, I'll call them, user endpoints. So since we're now just starting to see all these devices get connected, it's more or less waiting for hackers to find which holes, and then finding out what they found, and then being able to plug those holes. So yeah, I agree with you, Eric. We're going to see more protections come out for Internet of Things devices.
Cool. You went through what they've identified as the most relevant threats, and now the report provides mitigation practices, and I'll let you go on and talk about those a little bit more in detail.
Yeah, so I mean, if we go through some of these, this is a good list of top 10 things to look at to mitigate security issues. So we talked about email protection. So of course everybody has a password on their email, and it shouldn't be the same password that you're using for your bank or for any other account for that matter, because as Eric had mentioned earlier, I mean, we've seen a lot of hacks happen already, and we just anticipate seeing more and more of this. So as other systems get hacked, you don't want I'll say your department store login getting hacked, and then all of a sudden somebody can get into your email because you used the same password. So you want to be careful there. You also want to make sure that your machines have virus control and anti-malware control on them, and that you're running the processes on them. So we talked about endpoint protection. So that's basically just all the user devices. We want to make sure that there's some type of as I said, malware or antivirus protection on them. Access management, that's a big deal, because we don't want anybody just to be able to walk into a building and be able to access a device that's connected into a more internal system. So if there's a device in a public area, we want to make sure that those are locked down pretty well. Also, if they're in private areas, we want to make sure that they still have passwords on them. Again, passwords aren't the end all. People make bad passwords, so we want to make sure that people are using a good password. We use machine generated passwords, so these are passwords that are very difficult to guess. If you have to remember how somebody would try to do that, they would write a program that would say, okay, let's guess any word that's in the dictionary. Let's also add maybe an exclamation point or some other punctuation at the end of that, or at the beginning of it. Let's try the person's name. Let's try their birth date. Let's try. So these are the way these programs work. So if it's a machine-generated password, it's just a string of characters and numbers and punctuation that can't really easily be guessed. So that's highly recommended to try to use machine-generated passwords. We talked about data prevention and data protection and loss prevention. So we just want to make sure that that data is only accessed by the people that need to access it. And here's something we didn't talk about. If the data is in transit, if we have to send it somewhere, we want to make sure we encrypt it before we put it in the mailbox. Or even if we're going to drive it somewhere, you have a hard drive, you're going to drop off at another office or to a client. We want to make sure that before it leaves the office, it's encrypted when it's on that hard drive, when it's at rest. And then so as we're driving over there, if somebody steals our car or steals the hard drive for that matter, they're not getting that data. Managing your assets, that's another way of saying managing the devices you have. So how many times have you bought a new computer and put the old computer on the shelf and just forgot all about it? But let's not forget about it, because those devices still may have access to the network and may actually contain sensitive data on them. So we want to make sure that we are keeping steady lists of all of the assets that you have, and when you're decommissioning an asset, that you're wiping the hard drive, maybe even destroying the hard drive, depending on the type of device it is. Network management, we want to make sure that we're following all the network procedures. to keep the network safe and keep it secure, and particularly if it's facing the outside. You'll notice on some websites, you'll see it in the URL bar where it says HTTP. Sometimes it'll say HTTPS, and you'll see a little lock on it, kind of like in the picture here on the screen. And that means you're on a secure connection. This is usually when you're submitting information that could be sensitive, for example, a credit card number. So if you're going to a website that says it's your bank, or somewhere where you're buying something, they're asking you to put in a credit card number, you want to make sure that you see that little lock on there, that HTTPS, that you're using the secure socket layer to do that. That means you're transmitting the information encrypted. So someone can't be sniffing the traffic and just get your user ID or password or your credit card number for that matter. So, and also managing the vulnerabilities. I mean, this comes down to the policies. So, what Eric talked about in the beginning about having set policies that your business follows, and then also having security mechanisms to try to ensure those. But then I would actually add another piece, which I would say is auditing or logging. So we want to make sure that people are actually doing it. So it's one thing to say this is our policy. It's another thing to say that we're going to use these security mechanisms, but we also want to make sure that we're auditing that to make sure that people are actually doing it. So we can say that on a regular basis, say every 3 or 6 months, somebody's running the virus control on their machine, or your IT guy is doing it for you. Same thing with malware. Somebody's actually checking that the passwords are being updated. We're making sure that people aren't trying to get around them by saving passwords, either writing them on paper or as we talked about earlier, writing them on a sticky note and actually putting them on the monitor. You'd be surprised how many times I've walked into an office and seen sticky notes. I think in just about every office I've seen that. So it's just something that definitely should be addressed. So incident response, not only having these policies in place and safeguards and auditing them, but also in case something actually does happen, in case you are caught off guard, what is your incident response going to be? So how do you handle this? You want to know about how you're going to handle a problem before it happens. So do we shut down the machines? Do we shut down the systems? Is that something that's viable? Can we do that? Because maybe those systems are used on a regular basis. But if they're not, we need to come up with ways where we can, what we're going to do when a worst case scenario occurs, because even though it's good that we have the practices in place, and without having anything in place, you can almost guarantee that eventually you will get hacked in some way. But even with having good security in place, the hackers are just getting better and better. So it may actually happen, and you need to have a response plan ready to go. Eric talked about medical devices. I'll put these into the category of Internet of Things, because these are new devices where, for example, you have a Fitbit that's checking your blood pressure or your heart rate. So somebody's collecting that data. You want to make sure that these devices are not being compromised, and the data, and no one else can access your private medical data or financial data for that matter. And then and this comes down to, this is all about cybersecurity policies. That's what this all is.
Yeah, and Tony, one thing that I mentioned earlier, and I hear it shows itself, is in the report. I think that it shows that HHS was being realistic. So I'll use an example. For network management, the report actually provides specific steps to take for managing your network, and they separate it by small, medium, and large businesses. So for a small business, the report suggests network segmentation, physical security, and guest access. Obviously, for instance, in our office, we have a separate Wi-Fi for guests, and you need a password to log onto the system, and intrusion prevention. But then when you get into like a medium or large size office, when you get to large size or provider, network-based sandboxing and malware execution, network access control, anomalous network monitoring, and analytics. So they're not expecting that the small operator meet the same standards as a larger organization, and that's broken out separately in the report. But
yeah, and that's really feasibility. I mean, because I think they're smart enough to realize that a small business can't do sandboxing and things like that. I mean, it's just too much. It would be too much overhead for them. They wouldn't be able to stay in business. So it's just more. I mean, obviously, if you can do it, you should do more. But it's more for smaller businesses. We realize that it's a smaller group of people. You just have to manage your people better and manage your facility better. And you know, you may not be subject to these more stricter constraints.
Yeah, and it at this point, anybody who's listened to prior webinars that we've done on this or similar topics should know that the FTC and other organizations, especially the FTC in some states, are all over companies that have a breach and they have a privacy policy or a cybersecurity. They have some written policy and they're not following their own policy. So if you're an organization, you know, a small organization, may be tempting to just go find something on the internet and say, okay, this is going to be our policy, and publish that, whether you put it on your website or you tell your customers, your clients, patients, this is what you're doing. If you're not actually following it, you're setting yourself up for an action by maybe FTC enforcement for unfair and deceptive trade practices, or another either government organization or a private individual that sues you for not following your own written policies.
And this is why the auditing and logging is so important. So, you know, you have the policy, you have the security measures in place. So now you're proving that you're actually following those policies with the auditing. So we can say that, yes, everyone in the office did indeed, you know, I'm using virus control just because everybody understands that, but you know, everybody did run their virus control on their devices, you know, in these periods of times. And we can generate a report that shows that. So if that's part of our policy, then we can prove the policy with our audit reports.
Yeah, great point. Great point. All right, should we bring it into the home stretch?
That's it. Let's go to the conclusion, and then we'll open it up for questions.
So, yeah, as we noted earlier, you know, why is this important? One, the report's designed to help the healthcare industry. It's as I noted earlier, it's not law. It's not required that that anybody, you know, implement any of these policies or controls. But there was a lot, and reading through the report and the different annexes and pieces of the you know, attachments to the report, it's evident that a lot of time and thought went into coming up with a framework for the healthcare industry to meet these cybersecurity risks that we're seeing. So following the report, it's for your benefit as an organization, and it also, as I noted earlier, can provide potential defenses to negligence claims, potential safe harbors for actions by government entities in the event that you do have an incident that you need to report. If you're following this, it's going to give you a defense. And anything else that you'd add, Tony?
I'm muted. Yeah, no, I think that's the main thing, just to make sure you have your policies in place, to make sure that you're actually following them, and that you're auditing them. I mean, so you have to do the whole full circle. And if you're not doing anything, you should start right away, because it'll eventually catch up with you. It's better to be proactive now than be very sorry later. Even if it doesn't keep you from having a cyber attack, at least you'll be able to say that, hey, you know, we did everything we possibly could. You know, everything that, you know, we have a policy that we're following. We're making sure everyone is doing it. And, you know, sometimes there's just some really good hackers out there, or new hacks that come out. But in general, I don't want to tell people this is a futile effort, because in general, people are always going to follow the easy ways. That's what the hackers go after. They're not going, you know, you don't see too many, you know, I'll just say like government agencies or real like strong hackers trying new ways of getting in. They're using the old ways. They're still using, phishing emails. People are still getting phishing emails, and people are still falling for it. So as long as people are still falling for those, that's what they're going to keep doing. So I mean, just having the basics in place could protect you, a lot better than a lot of people think. But you have to go full circle. Not just have the policy, not just have the security in place, but also make sure you're auditing it, make sure you're generating the reports, so you can prove that you're doing it.
Yeah, it's a great point. And this area really is the ultimate intersection of law and technology, with policies and procedures that both have a technical aspect and things that are going to provide protection in the event that you have a legal issue. So Tony, I appreciate you jumping in today and joining us. Hopefully we can do this again. And we'll toss it out there and see if we have any questions. I haven't seen any pop up, but if anybody who's on our webinar today has a question you think about after the fact, or if you'd like any further information on anything that we talked about today, feel free to reach out, connect with Tony and I on LinkedIn if you haven't already. Shoot us an email. Our contact information is in this last slide. And with that, I wish everybody a happy remainder of their day and great week, and